Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the Post 38, revisioning a PhD and life through Anthro-Vision. Very odd title, but it will all become clear very, very shortly. But let me start with sort of the whiny, complainy bits of our culture, often encircling PhDs. You know, when people say, why are you doing that? Why are you spending so much of your life looking at something so small? And why don't you just go and get a real job? Well, all the answers to those questions will be revealed in the Post this week. And I'm going to raise and explore a remarkable series of ideas and a research project, but also a remarkable person, because this is part of our Inspiring Ideas and Inspiring People series. And I want to show you the power of a PhD to change the world. And it is time, I think, in our culture to be inspired by somebody who did a PhD. And it's in an area that most people laugh at or ridicule or scoff at. And this human went on to use that expertise and use that qualification to change the world, to change how we think about the world outside our universities. So let me talk to you about Dr. Gillian Tett. Dr. Tett is remarkable, and my first engagement with her work was actually well over a decade ago as I'm recording this post for you today. I read her book, Fool's Gold, published in 2009, and she provided at the time, and I would argue still provides, the best theorisation, the best understanding of the global financial crisis that hit the world between 2007 and particularly 2008. Now, I know, why is Tara talking about the GFC? Let me explain why. Our governments, often our universities, our journalism, our media outlets endlessly summon strategies. So all of us as citizens, we forget about what the global financial crisis did to the world. This event was simply catastrophic. Incompetent men in an incompetent financial sector were greedy, arrogant, and foolish. And they pretty well brought the world down with them. And what happened was, after the global financial crisis, public money bailed out the private banks. So private businesses failed and public money bailed them out. And the justification for this bizarre turn of events was the banks were, quote, too big to fail, end of quote. So what this meant was that money was removed from public education, money was moved from public health, and that money was then used to subsidise the greed, the errors and the failures of these incompetent bankers. So, a decade later, by the time a catastrophic event emerged, like a pandemic, the public health system around the world was in such a sick state that it couldn't even look after itself. So when a pandemic happened, who suffered? Doctors, nurses, health professionals who were simply, their lives were crushed and destroyed and broken and beaten because of a lack of funding into public health infrastructure. So that meant there were no funding sources available, the policies had been lagging for well over a decade, and the support was not available. So I think we forget that the chaotic health system that we've just lived through had a cause. It was caused by financial neglect. That is, public health was neglected to subsidise private banks and private corporations. Now, Gillian Tett was studying the financial system at this time, and she asked, quote, were the bankers mad, blind, evil, or were they simply grotesquely greedy? End of quote. Now, she showed, actually, in her analysis, that the global financial crisis was not caused by a few greedy bankers. That's the easy answer. It was actually a failure of the financial system. So Tett showed how derivatives trading allowed financiers to forget that behind all their figures were actual human beings with actual assets and lives and hopes and dreams. And of course, these were often quite vulnerable human beings as well. So that was part of the problem. You forgot that this money was actually about people and vulnerable people's lives. But secondly, she used that great phrase that I've used a great deal in the subsequent decade, that the other problem was that the banks, quote, were dancing around the regulators, end of quote. Wow. Now, people, really vulnerable people's debt, became the stake for the bet on the economy from thousands of financiers. Now, JP Morgan in particular bundled up bonds, derivatives and lending into a single group, if you will, and then put that bet on the economy. And they lost that bet. But Gillian Tett showed that this was a failure of a system and a failure of regulators to do their job. So finance capitalists forgot that the debt that they were using came from real people with real lives and a real context. And this was an absolutely brilliant analysis. And Tett actually predicted what was going to happen at least 18 months before the global financial crisis. She saw this system coming. She saw the crisis coming. Wow. And she was ignored. So how did this happen? Why did it happen? Well, she explained how a culture of greed is created, a culture of risk, a culture of denial about the lives and the emotions of other people, and what happens when you've got a culture without regulation. And when you've got that very toxic little bundle, it destroys people, and indeed it can destroy systems in the world. So this is an incredibly brilliant but also incredibly courageous woman, and how she's done her research tells us a lot about the gifts that a university education can give to society and culture and industry. So Gillian Tett was born in 1967. She is currently the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large at the Financial Times. And education, higher education, and yes, a doctorate really matters to this story. She attended Clare College, Cambridge, and she gained her PhD in social anthropology, completing fieldwork in Tajikistan just as the Soviet Union was losing its grip. She was very dissatisfied with the state of academic anthropology at that point, and she got a job as a journalist. So here we have the archetypal study of the supposedly pointless PhD, a person studying marriage rituals in Tajikistan that resulted, of course, in her learning the methodologies and the strategies and the structures that enabled her understanding of the global financial crisis. So, besides writing outstanding journalism, Dr. Tett has also written 4 really fantastic books. Saving the Sun, How Wall Street Mavericks Shook Up Japan's Financial World and Made Millions. Fool's Gold, that I've talked about, but also 2 more books that are simply spectacular. The Silo Effect, The Peril of Expertise and the Promise of Breaking Down Barriers, and Anthro-Vision, A New Way to See Business and Life. And that book was published in 2021. This is so important. I cannot convey to you how important this is. We are hearing so much rubbish at the moment about PhDs. Why do one? You know, we've got too many PhD graduates, what are they going to do? Blah, blah, blah. But what a gift these remarkable people are as they populate occupations and professions around the world. Would Tett have been such an effective journalist without a PhD? Hell no. She used anthropological methodologies in her toolkit for journalism. So Tett was hired by the Financial Times as a correspondent from the Soviet Union and Europe. And by 1997, she was posted to Tokyo and became the bureau chief. But then she moved to the US as managing editor and continues to maintain a very strong connection with higher education. She's the chairwoman of the Board of Trustees for the Knight Bagelhold Fellowship in Economics and Business Journalism at Columbia University, and through her incredible writing and research, she's gained a whole series of honorary degrees around the world. So what is brilliant here is Tett was able to use ethnographic methods to understand J.P. Morgan and she discovered the insularity of that culture, and they created financial instruments that were not anchored to any form of actual reality. This was the realisation that triggered that great book, The Silo Effect. That book has changed my life, can I say. Anyone interested in power, how power is held, any of you thinking of entering a position of leadership or a position of power, and I hope you will, please read this book. It was published in 2015, and again, it predicted much of what was going to occur through COVID, through the pandemic. This book will change how you think about workplace cultures. She explored how silos in workplaces are created and what happens when they are. So we have bizarre decision-making, extraordinary and ridiculous risks, and unbelievable errors. We've all seen institutions, multiple institutions do that. The silo effect has caused it. Now, at its most basic, she asks a key question, quote, "Why do humans working in modern institutions collectively act in ways that sometimes seem stupid?" End of quote. Now, she answers this question using anthropological theory, showing how we are all blind to our own blindness because of the fragmentation of the systems around us. She locates what she calls, quote, tunnel vision and tribalism, end of quote. And she believes they're the cause of so many of our institutional problems. So people are sort of trapped in their specialist groups or specialist departments, their, quote, pockets of knowledge, end of quote. So they live in their silos. And to quote myself, it means we don't know what we don't know. This is not only a characteristic of business, of course. We see it in BP, we have seen it in Sony, seen it in the Bank of England, but of course also large universities really demonstrate these tendencies. And Tett describes tribalism as being incredibly dangerous to universities, and the lack of diverse disciplines in leadership posts in contemporary universities are causing these problems. Very interesting argument. So she explores how this lack of diversity in leadership roles in institutions originally made her very embarrassed to talk about the fact she had a PhD, and she had a PhD in social anthropology. Quote, "When I first became a financial journalist, I was often very wary about revealing my peculiar past. The type of qualifications that command respect on Wall Street or the City of London are MBAs or advanced degrees in economics, finance, astrophysics, or another quantitative science. Knowing about the wedding customs of the Tajiks does not seem an obvious training to write about the global financial crisis or the banking system. But if there is one thing the great financial crisis showed, it is that finance and economics are not just about numbers. Culture matters too." End of quote. So silos are a way, a quite simple way, of organising the world, and they're often based on arrogance, on hierarchies, and on ignorance. And this has huge consequences for the rest of our lives. So, for example, let's use the really catastrophic example. When emergency workers rushed to the World Trade Center in September 2001, it became clear that the walkie-talkies that were used by the police, that were used by the fire emergency services, and also by health professionals could not tune into the same communication channel. So first responders, at a moment of crisis, could not talk to each other. And no one had seen this problem before the crisis. So cultural anthropologists notice these sorts of problems because their whole point, they think about classification systems, how a group in power renders pretty arbitrary and often pretty bizarre systems and structures and truths, sort of rendering them normal and natural so people don't think about them anymore. So really strange stuff exists and we sort of forget that it's strange. So power is sustained by what Tett describes as, quote, the psychology of denial, end of quote. So when the classification systems become rigid, then silos become entrenched, and then those silos and the people in them become blind to risks. And they also, can I say, become blind to the exciting opportunities outside of the silo. She makes the point that we need to, yes, monitor the information flow. But it's not simply, I love this so much, it's not simply a matter of sharing the information through an organisation. So we often talk about the transparency of information, which I believe in very, very strongly. But she argues we need to, quote, create a culture that enables everyone to interpret information and let different interpretations be heard, end of quote. Changed my life. Changed my life. So the key is not information. The key is information in context. The key is information literacy. So this means we empower the people that we work with to interpret information and to share the building blocks to knowledge. This is tremendous. But I want to inspire you in this Inspirational People, Inspirational Ideas series with a book that also will change your life. I want it to always be a reminder to you about the value of education, the value of higher education, the value of a PhD. So in a time of anti-intellectualism and anti-expertise, and wow, we're living in that at the moment, it is important to remember what one well-educated human being can do when they move into the world. The most amazing book that I recommend to you is titled Anthro-Vision, A New Way to See Business and Life. Published 2021, the book will change your life. The book looks at organisations and groups and communities and individual markets, certainly, but deploys an anthropological lens. But it is more than this because she's offering a lens on our current lens, if that makes sense. So she's providing a lens on our current way of seeing power and knowledge and culture. This is a wow from me. So Dr. Tett in Anthro-Vision explores in detail what studying a PhD did for her, looking at the marriage rituals of Tajikistan, gave her energy and insights that enabled her career. It is an amazing story, amazing human being that shows the importance of what she describes as the other AI, anthropological intelligence. To make her case, she uses that great line from Ralph Linton, quote, "The last thing a fish would ever notice would be water," end of quote. If you think about that deeply, you sit in that, that'll change your life. But see, what Tett was able to do was understand the water. and having been educated through fieldwork methodologies, living with a family in a mountain village. Now she states, quote, "The reason is that anthropology is an intellectual framework that enables you to see around corners, spot what is hidden in plain sight, gain empathy for others, and fresh insights onto problems." End of quote. Think about the importance of seeing and learning about and researching that which is in plain sight. Racism, climate change, pandemics, weird behaviours on social media, the consequences of deregulation on water, weird decisions about politics or business or universities or education. And she argues that many of the tools that we use to understand the world are not functioning well. So financial models are failing, economic forecasts are wrong, political polling, again, wrong. Dr. Tett is arguing for Anthro-Vision, not tunnel vision, but lateral vision. Put another way, we need to understand problems and issues and topics, not within rigid or finite parameters, but within a wider culture. So to understand the fish, we need to understand the water. And of course, that's pretty difficult to do if you're the fish. And so therefore, Anthro-Vision allows us to understand the relationship between insiders and outsiders, but understand the differences between the insiders and outsiders, and summon diverse lenses on diverse problems. The other part of Anthro-Vision for me is even more important. Quote, "Cultivating a mindset of empathy for strangers and valuing diversity." End of quote. Think about the dreadful trolling and name-calling that exists in our culture. Yes, particular groups are behaving weirdly, bizarrely, infuriatingly, I get that. But how does shaming them, how does giving them a nasty label actually help the situation at all? Listening to someone else's view is crucial. We learn about that view, we understand the difference of that view, and we hopefully gain a little bit of empathy. Understanding the strange, familiar relationships reveals the blind spots in ourselves and in our culture and the consequences of those blind spots. So think about the cliched phrase we heard endlessly through the pandemic. Here we go. Believe the science. Believe the science. Believe the science. Fish water. Believe the science. Believe the science. Believe the science. Do you notice that the phrase was believe the science, not understand the science? Now, why that matters is, if we believe in something, it's part of a faith structure. So if you can believe in something, you cannot believe in something, right? So it's treating science like a religion. But the challenge with scientific and empirical inquiry, which I respect enormously, by the way, you know that, but the challenge that exists with scientific methods is that they commence observation only after first isolating a research question. So a research question emerges first, and then the observation to answer that research question occurs, right? Now that's great. Scientific method, big fan, rock and roll. And of course you have to then research that problem in a way that the outcome or the evidence is repeatable. So we'll run this test and then we'll run it again and then we'll run it again. So the evidence you generate from this process must be repeatable and transparent. Great, okay. But anthropology and many of the humanities and social science disciplines are different. They start instead with observation. They start with observation. So that means we park prior judgment. There's no sense of what's important or what's normal. There's no sense about how the research question should be structured or configured. So this is an open-ended observation. And the goal of that open-ended observation is to locate patterns. So such methodologies obviously can engage a fair amount of disrespect from scientists, because if your focus is on data, getting data, repeating that data, showing rigour, then obviously this sort of observation stuff and patterns, that seems absolutely bizarre. And as I said, I have enormous respect for scientific methodologies, no critique from me at all, profoundly important paradigm. But you often hear me talk a great deal about the importance of the comprehensive university. And why I do that is because I understand the gift of multiple disciplines, of activating multiple methodologies, ontologies and epistemologies, yeah? Because that diversity of approaches blocks a silo effect. And that means those of us in universities and beyond can start to be open to the ideas that we're seeing, to understand cultural and social systems first. So Tett talks about the importance of the worm's eye view rather than the bird's eye view. A lot of leadership modelling, of course, is based on the bird's eye view, right? Whereas actually she's arguing for the worm's eye view. Now, yes, the culture shock can be incredibly painful when you've got that worm's eye view. It is frightening, it is threatening, because it's questioning all the truths that you hold dear in your life. But we need to remember that humans, humans are meaning makers. And we simply cannot assume that all humans make meaning in the same way. Now, she showed how experts in the US and the UK in particular didn't learn the lessons of SARS and Ebola, because SARS and Ebola happened in sort of non-European locations, and particular models of, I would argue, colonisation and power and arrogance were in place. So Tett shows the consequences of ignoring the lessons of SARS and Ebola, because it also meant ignoring the lessons of social science and social scientists. So Peter Bayer, Gideon Laskow and Christos Lynteris were remarkable anthropologists who studied SARS. Brilliant research. And they studied mask wearing during SARS. And they concluded, here we go, that the masks were important, yes, to contain the contagion, but this isn't only about the hard sciences. It was about understanding the ritual of putting on a mask and what putting on a mask did to behaviour, because it was a psychological prompt to behave differently, to activate different patterns of living. So mask wearing became a symbol, think about rituals, became a symbol for maintaining civic norms, respecting other human beings, caring for others. So that was the, I would argue, the semiotic and the cultural system around mask wearing. That was the lesson from SARS. So instead of learning from this very, very important social scientific research, I won't get upset, but think about the millions of lives that would have been saved if this research had been applied, yeah? But okay, so instead of learning those lessons, when David Halpin was invited to go to the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, so SAGE, in the UK, so a social scientist was invited to go to SAGE, and he suggested, you know what, how about we learn, we as British people, we learn about mask wearing, what worked in Germany and what worked in South Korea. Now, he was completely ignored, because SAGE is dominated by experimental scientists, particularly medical scientists and politicians. So they decided instead on pretty rigid top-down policies. They decided to put money in expensive, and actually it ended up being completely ineffectual, expensive digital contact tracing software, and sadly they delivered mixed messaging on masks. Yeah. Catastrophic. Now, Gus O'Donnell, the former head of the British Civil Service, in September 2020 stated, and hang on to yourself, head of the British Civil Service, quote, "The government's incorporation of expertise from behavioural and other human sciences has been woeful. When the government says it follows the science, that really means it follows the medical sciences, which has given it a one-sided perspective and led to some questionable policy decisions." End of quote. Wow. So think about slogans like "Make America Great Again." This was a refusal to acknowledge that other nations may have knowledge or expertise that may be of value. So what happened was the US and the British governments assumed that their medical systems were the best in the world and ignored reverse innovation. Now, reverse innovation is an incredible concept. I'm doing a lot of work on it at the moment. It's often also called trickle-up innovation, and this innovation occurs first in the developing world, and Chris Trimble is the great scholar of this concept and idea, in my respect to Chris. So what happens is, with reverse innovation, is inexpensive models that work well in nations with limited infrastructure are then shown to be incredibly useful in nations around the world. And this has been particularly important for health systems, particularly regional, rural and remote health delivery, and also social entrepreneurship modelling. So think about your life. Think about all our lives. Think about the consequences of staying in our familiarity, of ignoring or pretending that the strange, the different, doesn't exist. And we construct all these boundaries around ourselves to stop the odd and the different and the bit weird coming into our lives. Now, Gillian Tett confirms, quote, "We need to see what we ignore," end of quote. Poof. She is so convincing, but how do we get this Anthro-Vision? Well, she does provide some strategies for us. Firstly, we have to recognise, first premise, we are all creatures of our environment. Secondly, there is no singular cultural frame. Humans are diverse. We should also try to seek out opportunities to immerse our mind and our lives in the strategies and ideas of others. And when we immerse ourselves in the lives of others, we gain empathy. So we start to look through the world with a different lens, which allows us to see ourselves differently. So we must, quote, "actively listen to social science," end of quote. So ponder the rituals that are part of our routines. COVID-19 showed that fighting a pandemic requires a lot more than medical sciences. Remember, people were fighting over toilet paper. People were fighting over whether or not they should wear a mask. Now, they weren't fighting over toilet paper because they didn't like the medical science. They were fighting over toilet paper because they were frightened, because they were confused. And at this point where they were confused and frightened, they summoned the importance of their individuality. Me, me, me. I have the right to choose. Choose, choose, choose. I have the right to choose. I know I'm frightened, but I can choose what I want to do. Now, think about the tragedy of, at that point, through the fear, claiming the importance of being an individual and choosing. Because that choice, in many cases, cost them their health and the health of their family members. For too long, I think we've lived in these cliches, sort of my way or the highway, or what's that cap, America first, right? Our cultures have valued shopping and consumerism rather than play and leisure. We validated choice and agency over community and communication. And we've all lived in fear rather than inculcated empathy. Now, Anthro-Vision asks more of us and shows that a PhD, even in anthropology, can challenge and transform how we think about New York bankers, medical scientists during a pandemic, or the normative pathways into university leadership. So when we see the outsider, the strange, the different, we start to see ourselves and the world with a new lens. I wish you love, light and peace. Tia.